you for this opportunity to share my research, some of my research and some of my thoughts. As you mentioned, most of my work focuses on the political and social consequences of the net and the many platforms that it supports. I used to say lately, but it's actually really for the past 10 years now, starting in 2011, I became interested in structures of feeling, soft structures of feeling, or affect and civic engagement. So, this is most of what I'll talk about today through going over some research we've been conducting with my colleagues at the University of Illinois, but also on my own on structures of feeling, structures of information, social media, social movements, and ultimately democracy. So back in 2011, with my colleagues, we became interested in what was then a very new and very different medium, Twitter. And we started tracking sentiment expression on prominent tags there since the early days of the Egyptian revolution that led to the regime reversal of Hosni Mubarak, and then going on to the Indignados movements and Occupy Wall Street, but also trending topics in general. I will summarize general conclusions because there's obviously not enough time to cover everything. And I'll talk especially about what I mean by the terms affective news and affective publics and how they connect to developments of the past, but also current contemporary developments. I'll talk about how we got there and draw connections between those two concepts and the growth of populism and the contemporary moment of COVID-19. Basically, how we got from the moment of the Arab Spring, which was greeted as a very sort of, pure moment of revolution by several. And primary question was then, did social media make the revolution? More like in my mind, like the revolution made Twitter and social media, to Trump, who gave the medium a completely different spin, to Brexit, to various other iterations of populism, from there to COVID-19, and from there to beyond COVID-19, to themes of social injustice, to mobs storming the Capitol in DC recently, and wrap all of this up with my latest book, which is called After Democracy. So I'd like to start first with some things that kind of underpin our understanding of technology, democracy, and equality. The internet, as we all know by now, is not a magical space. It cannot create something out of nothing. It cannot create something that does not exist. It cannot create or destroy democracy on its own. It opens up more paths to connection. Some of those paths connect democratically oriented people. Some of those paths connect fascists. The internet will pluralize, but it does not necessarily or inherently democratize, nor does it amplify voice on equal terms, and nor does it extinguish social problems. It does not create hate speech. It's not responsible for it, but it does make hate speech more visible. It makes it more easily spreadable. So it amplifies, but not on equal terms. So as I like to say, in paraphrasing George Orwell, all voices are equal online. Some voices are more equal than others. Now, some things about our own approach and how we started out. We were interested primarily in Twitter as a news storytelling medium. I had spent a lot of my time studying sociality online, and then the other part of my work had to do with journalism and what online media do for the practices of news storytelling. So we were not looking for affect with an A. It's not a particularly fun or interesting thing to research. It can be very complicated and confusing to understand and explain. But we stumbled on it as the most convincing explanation for the kind of phenomena we were encountering. Let me begin by explaining what affect is. So it's often confused with emotion. It's not exactly the same. It is about the intensity of emotion. Affect is sentiment, mood, the sense of a feeling. It is the intensity with which we feel. Let me give you some examples. So for instance, when you hear a song that you like and you start tapping your foot to it, that is an affective reaction. When you're taking part in a conversation and you're nodding along, not to indicate agreement, but just to show a sign that you're listening, you're not tuning out, you're tuned in to the conversation, right? Tuning into something is a word, a verb that we use very often when we describe an affective process of attunement. That is also an affective reaction. More recently, the crowds that stormed the Capitol in Washington, D.C., that were chanting, hang Mike Pence, that was an affective reaction. That was a result of uh, crowds, mobs tuning in, effectively attuning themselves to a rhetoric that was presented by a number of speakers, including Giuliani, President Trump, that prompted that particularly intense affective reaction, right? There's gradations, variations to affective reaction. Obviously, on on a scale of 0 to 10, tapping your foot to a song that you like is nowhere near chanting hang Mike Pence. There's a different level of intensity, and affect is about just that, the level, the intensity, and then the density, the texture of that particular form of intensity. And this definition that I'm giving you, I'm drawing from research, literature in political science, psychology, and philosophy, and synthesizing all that work to provide a very relatable definition and understanding of affect. So, in response to social movements emerging, we wanted to understand how Twitter functioned as a medium for news storytelling, how stories were framed, how they were presented from a specific point of view, how events turned into stories. So, we looked at news values as the things that turn events into stories. And of course, we were very interested in premediation. And premediation describes the form that an event takes on before it turns into a story. So, for example, again, most recently, the coverage of the US elections, which went on for about a week, is very much an example of premediation, of an event being broadcast over and over again without it being turned into a story, right? Because we're having constant updates, breaking news, which are not really breaking any new news. They're just repeating the fact that we don't have any closure yet, and therefore we don't have a story. And then, of course, at the end of that event, we have a variety of different stories emerging about that event. Only one of them, of course, representing the truth, which had to do with the actual winner of the election. Same thing about the way in which the attack on the Capitol was reported. Again, as an event in premediation, in the making, and this aspect of reporting, the premediated aspect, what it does is, what it offers, rather, what it lends is that it's very rich in affect. It creates and promotes this sort of obsession with instantaneity in reporting. And it does create, obviously some feelings of anxiety. That's only natural. We conducted big data and analysis, and also deep data, paired that with qualitative looks into narrower, smaller samples of the larger groupings of data that we examined to understand whether social media make or break movements, how that happens, what they do to revolutions, elections, and democracies in general. We were then led to the formation of two concepts. The first one is affective news, and it has to do with the shape news takes on as it is broadcast to the rest of the world via social media. Although, again, these tendencies can be traced to the pre-social media era, and affective news is not something that we encounter on Twitter or social media only. It's something that we watch daily on TV. So again, the examples that I mentioned, but really, the news scroller with the constant updates that are really not updating, they're just sort of refreshing to create the illusion of communicating something new. The breaking news alerts that are startling you, but are really just reproducing what already has been reporting. All of this is an example, presents an example of affective news. We see it on social media. We also see it on the dominant structures of storytelling on TV. We also see it in a variety of forms of online journalism that are becoming prevalent, that include, for instance, clickbait-based forms of story writing. Affective news is characterized by a rhythm and pace of storytelling that's instant, it's emotive, It's phatic, so it's obsessed with this idea of always being on top of everything that's happening, of reporting on the event even before we know with certainty what sort of event that's going to come out to be, what sort of story is going to come out with it. There's repetition and intensity that set the pace online, on Twitter, for instance. Um, Through the practices of retweeting and quote tweeting, but on television through the practices of just repeating the same news over and over again. Um, the most fascinating thing I think about affective news is that we see, if any of you follow the work of Walter Awn and the distinction between a primary and a secondary orality, is that we notice with affective news a very interesting combination of oral and print cultures of storytelling, a blending of the interpersonal traditions of conversation with the set dominant hegemonic practices of broadcasting. And these two are reconciled to the point where news, fact, drama, opinion, mood blend into one, to the point where telling one, distinguishing one from the other is very difficult, and doing so kind of misses the point. So, a couple of things about affect and news storytelling, and then also affect and mobilization. It's very important to keep in mind that affect is not the event. It's a layer to the event. It's a way for citizens and also for journalists to feel their way into the story. Things become problematic when we have situations, instances where affect is being reported as the sole event, and therein we have news coverage that leads to a flattening of the news, loss of substance, a loss of context, a loss of significance, no sense of the so what question. Why is this important? For instance, we hear a lot about Hillary Clinton. We heard a lot about Hillary Clinton's emails and that notorious server, but we never got to hear greater detail about what those emails were about, what was on that server. We hear chants and reporting of the infamous now defund the police movement, but we that's followed up with very little context of what that largely symbolic call really is about, really means. And so understandably, this creates news that tends to heighten anxiety because it doesn't really impart any information of actual substance. We listen to a lot of noise, but very little substance. Um, and finally, a word on affect and mobilization, which I think relates then and connects the concept of affective news to then the idea of affective publics. Affect and the kind of intensity that it cultivates can sustain feelings of community that are able to reflexively and under opportune circumstances drive publics forward or entrap them in a stage of engaged passivity, or sort of stop and go motion, standstill motion. Which of the two will transpire, largely depends on a wide array of historical circumstance, context, and windows of opportunity for change that emerge, which then, and it also has to do with the texture of these formations, these groups that circulate and share affective news. And so let me now talk about affective publics, how they connect to all of this, and what I mean by this concept. So I understand affective publics as network publics that come together, are identified, or are disbanded through expressions of sentiment. So very much influenced by Dana Boyd's definition of network publics, but I wanted to add some texture, some tonality to it. I wanted to talk about not just how these publics connect, but also what tonality, what texture, what modality their form of expression attains, because they connect via these particular platforms. They are characterized by the following key aspects, and I'd like to talk about those a little bit. The first one that I want to emphasize is that affective publics materialize uniquely and leave distinct digital footprints. And now, this may seem like at first, like a very simplistic point to make, but it's worth emphasizing because all too often we're swayed and we're impressed by the impact that one movement made online, and we assume that other movements to follow will have the same impact, and that's simply not the case. Um, all movements are effectively mobilized, but each movement is unique and each movement leaves its own distinct digital imprint. Okay? QAnon is effectively mobilized, is a very different movement, has a very different digital imprint from Black Lives Matter, also effectively mobilized, very different impact, very different movement. Uh, These movements support connective but not necessarily collective action for the most part. In most cases, we don't have a collective, collectively determined, collectively anointed authority that determines what the narrative is going to be, what the tone that this movement is going, sets the tone rather for this particular movement. Which is why, and here I'm referring to the connective collective distinction that Lansman and Alex Segerberg make. So, because these movements are mostly connective and not collective in nature, they often produce narratives that end up being a little bit fragmented. Um, there are exceptions to this rule. There are some cases where movements manage to produce narratives that are quite cohesive. And that happens in cases where the movement has connectively anointed curators who then organize the stream, uh, filter it, and manage to present a narrative that is intact, that has integrity, and often end up having to prevent or thwart a number of attempts to hashtag hijack the movement or to just counter delegitimize the movement. So, an example of a movement that had particularly tight curational infrastructure was the Me Too movement. Maintained the integrity of its narrative throughout because it had prominent celebrity figures, but also respected journalists who had done some outstanding um, news writing and investigative work, and took care to preserve the integrity of that particular narrative. That particular narrative. Occupy Wall Street, on the other hand, did not. They had a rather fragmented narrative on purpose, because the point of that movement was not to anoint any leaders or to give anybody exceptional power, but rather to keep everyone on equal basis. So it was only natural that they would produce a narrative that was very polyphonic, but also a little bit fragmented. Um, Affective publics are powered by affective statements of opinion, fact, or a blend of both, which then in turn produce ambient, always on, sort of like an all feeds that serve like as an online home for the movement. And then these feeds, these ambient, always on feeds, further connect and pluralize expression in regimes, but also in movements that are democratically motivated and not. They typically produce disruptions or interruptions of dominant political narratives by presencing underrepresented viewpoints. Um, these publics are sustained by streams that are convened around affective commonalities, commonalities based around sentiment, bonds formed around sentiment. Uh, these publics are not going to have an impact that's immediate or instant, or directly political, sociocultural, economic, or legal. Their impact is mostly symbolic. The agency that they claim is largely semantic. They claim it through the discursive renegotiation of key terms. So, saying things like defund the police, putting those terms together, even though that's not actually what all members of that movement mean, putting those two words together presents a very powerful symbolic statement. Um, Saying something like Occupy Wall Street, again, a very symbolic statement, intended as an open signifier, intended as as an open call for people to stand up and be counted alongside that movement, as part of that movement. Now, to say that something has symbolic impact is no small thing. You know, symbolism lies at the heart of every revolution. Before any form of major change, we have to have some symbolism that brings people together. Um, and I think it bears emphasizing here because all too often we're swayed by the virality with which, by the speed with which information moves online. And we think that change is going to follow in an equally speedy manner. And when it does not, we're disappointed in ourselves and our politicians, in our democratic structures and our institutions, but it's not just those things that have let us down. It's also our own expectations that have misled us because change is gradual. And in the words of Raymond Williams, revolutions are long. And I add, they have to be long in order to attain meaning. How does this unfold in the various studies that we conducted? So we've been fortunate to see some to witness some interesting developments and a, a number of different applications or ways in which the, the constructs that we developed apply. So we started, as I mentioned first, with the hashtag Egypt movement, and we focused on the first days of the movement that just led up to and then just immediately following the resignation of Hosni Mubarak. So during that period, again, not after, because that movement ended up being something else. During that time, we saw and we were studying a very different Twitter, a Twitter without any bots or very few bots, uh, um, a medium, a platform that was just becoming relevant, was just beginning to reveal its potentiality for social change. More importantly, though, a variety of the people who were involved with that particular tag and that particular movement, they were deeply vested in producing a narrative that was accurate about the movement. So something that we saw quite often was people correcting and self-correcting, just sort of this obsession with not getting the story out instantly, but getting the story out and having it be the right story, the correct version of the story. So there was a lot of conversation, there was a lot of reciprocality in that stream that made that stream very cohesive. In all of the streams that I've studied, I think that was the most cohesive, the most reciprocal stream I have encountered. With Occupy, we saw again a very different movement and a variety of different kinds of performative actions, rhetorical actions online, because again, the objective of the movement was different. It was, again, they were presenting publics with an open call to stand up and be counted. Um, no, populism works in a variety of different directions. It is effectively mobilized through open signifiers, but it is used to serve, to mobilize as a conduit to a variety of different ideologies and tendencies. With the Occupy movement, what we saw right away were content injections that were aimed at disrupting the movement, a lot of hashtag hijacking that was designed to delegitimize the movement and to create almost a standstill motion for the movement that ended up in the move ended up with the movement being misrepresented in mainstream or legacy media. The movement played its part, but I think we realized what part it played many years later, a few years later, rather, I should say, 3 or 4. Black Lives Matter is a particularly interesting case because in the first iteration of that movement, and in the early days, we saw strength and cohesion in the narrative. And then eventually we saw a lot of hashtag hijacking aimed at distracting from the point of the movement through the use of counterattacks like, all lives matter and white lives matter and so on. So unfortunately, there were peaks to that movement in its first iteration that created windows of opportunity that were not taken advantage of in the way that they could have been. In the second, if we might call it a second iteration of the movement that was more articulate this past summer in the United States, we saw the same peaks of activity. We saw the same windows of opportunity open. We saw similar attempts at counterattacks and hashtag hijacking, but we had public and politicians that were differently primed, possibly because of the previous um, iteration of the movement, possibly because of the upcoming elections, definitely because of the tone of President Trump that played its own part in polarizing the nation. So this is a fascinating example of the sort of history and variation and trajectory that the digital imprint of a movement can take on. And of course, that the history that of a movement, which is fascinating in and of its own right. With MAGA, we see, on the other hand, a lot of what I talked about, referred to before as um, being entrapped in a state of engaged passivity. So, a lot of intensity in terms of the rhetoric and in terms of the performativity that was present in that stream, but very little directional movement. A lot of Discord and a lot of, bot related or bot articulated expression that, muddied the waters. Um, in the end, do social media make or break elections? No, they do not tell us what to do. They tell us what to think about and how to think about it. That's basic agenda setting theory for us. Do they make or break revolutions? No, but they do intensify particular movements by mobilizing populist sentiments in a variety of different directions, by connecting, but also dividing, populism and affect. Populism is activated via affect, can connect, but it can also divide. It's a double-edged sword if you follow Laclau and his work on populism. A lot of a lot of scholars of populism make the argument that all populism is bad. A number of political science scholars will say that there's good populism and bad populism. My take is that we lack the proper vocabulary. I wouldn't say that there's good or bad populism. I would say that there are circumstances or rhetoric that engages the populist sentiment. Obviously, when we talk about populist sentiment, we talk about affect, we talk about intensity. And if there's something at the other end, if there's a directionality to that, then we might see an outcome that's meaningful for society. If it's populism for populism's sake, then we see nothing. So we get back to that state of engaged passivity. A lot of movement, but not really actually getting anywhere. And social media are particularly good at enabling acts of symbolic impact. Um, I wanted to talk about the stock market for a second. I don't know if any of you are following what's going on with AMC and GameStop today and the effective cycles of that, but maybe someone will have a question about that. I'd like to get on to the last 2 points I wanted to make. How how does all of this connect to what we're going through today? I think I've alluded to that a little bit. Here's the thing, increasingly, truth has become a mechanism for belonging. It always has been. Okay, it's part of the way in which, for instance, religion gets its way, through selling, through promoting a particular kind version of truth. But this need for belonging is felt more intensely at times of increased insecurity, at times of crisis. So we now are experiencing such a time, collectively and collaboratively and connectively, I hope. And we tune in and support around the uncertainty that we all experience, that we all feel regarding our civic futures and the civic futures of communities of color, in particular in the country where I live. The news that we receive is effective in anticipation of what might happen, times 10, because we have all of the anxiety of the pandemic. And the very nature of a pandemic is permeated and effective. The way in which a pandemic unfolds, it cannot be anticipated, right? Can only be monitored, and then we we adjust our behavior in return. So all of this creates a sense of heightened anticipation, heightened anxiety, because we live in circumstances where we truly do not know how this pandemic might unfold, but we want to know really, really bad. Yet the rhythms of effective news, of our news infoscape, reflected in the visual order, the grammar, the syntax, the maps of information, that cartography of what we call the commons, do very little to soothe our anxiety. They cast us into effective publics where we want to be or not. And our agency is discursive, our power is liminal, it's of a transitional nature, and our impact can only be symbolic. Perhaps that is enough. We are caught in this nexus of events that are constructed through accelerated but also slow modes of living, right? We have all these technologies that accelerate our pace of living, but we've been forced to slow down and stay indoors in a way that's completely contrarian to that with which we've lived for the past decades. We need to plan for the future in a hurry for many contingencies and scenarios with very little information. Uh, but our daily infrastructure is slow. Our living quarters force us to slow down. Slow living, on the one hand, yet accelerated, intense, affective news storytelling, completely out of sync with our experience. We never really learned to make a slow news structure of storytelling. We never really learned, I think, to live with a slow news structure. I think if we had it, it would take some getting used to. We might not even recognize it. And it's difficult for us, we haven't gotten accustomed. We're in the process of getting accustomed to slower structures of feeling. We are driven, we are socialized into making sense of everything immediately. And this is, I think, making things way worse than they could be. We want to know how COVID will affect us immediately. We want to know when we're going to get the vaccines. We want to know why there's not enough vaccines. We're constantly monitoring how many vaccines there are. We want to have positions on how riots that are happening connect to or disrupt the logic of a connective action right away. We always must have an opinion, a hot take immediately. It is exhausting. So this was my starting point. This was what I was thinking about when I started work on my latest book, After Democracy. I wanted to slow down and do something completely random and impromptu and spontaneous and just sort of follow the desire lines of democracy. So I started this project about nearly, I think, 5 years ago, definitely pre-COVID. I decided to travel the world and have conversations with strangers. So just approach random strangers in different countries and chat them up a little bit, and then ask them all the same three questions. What is democracy? What does it mean to be a citizen? And what might make democracy better? I ended up talking to people from all over the world, from a variety of different regimes, Russia, China, UK, Canada, the US, Brazil, and Mexico, a number of refugees from Syria, Libya, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Egypt, Tunisia, um, and had a number of interesting conversations. When I utter the title of this book, After Democracy, people think that I'm talking about something that's quite pessimistic and that I'm perhaps talking about the end of democracy. And I think a natural presumption is that I got the inspiration to write this book during the past 4 years. Because a lot of things have happened to democracies around the world in the past 4 years. But I did not. I got the inspiration for this book during what I thought, a very positive moment for our democracy. Um, I first got the idea for this book during the Obama presidency because I was observing him as a politician, um, as a rhetorical figure, his manner. Um, his way of dealing with crisis, of organizing governance, of speaking to the public. And of course, there's another example of a person who used, open signifiers, slogans, if you will, that were oriented in a populistic way. Okay, he was first elected with vaguely populistic and then re-elected with a message of hope. Again, but he followed up on those messages, right? There was a direction. He took us somewhere. But that's not really what inspired me. What inspired me mostly was his manner. It was very different from anything else that I had seen. It was very new. Um, and I was perplexed because he just kept stumbling into these insurmountable obstacles. It was very clear that he had a different idea, or it seemed to me, the way I was reading it, he had one idea in his head and a different thing kept happening. And I thought, well, this man is very advanced. He's an advanced politician. I'm not sure where he's come from or how he's dawned on us. Perhaps he's come from outer space, or perhaps he's come from the future. But what I can definitely say is that the democracy in which he's functioning is old. It's dated. I'm looking at him and it feels like I'm looking at a middle-aged person trying to get into a pair of jeans that they wore when they were teenagers. We've taken a person who's got different new ideas and we've given him a structure of democracy that's centuries old and constructed for a very different era, a very different way of living. And so then I thought, perhaps democracy is not it. Perhaps there's something better after democracy. And technology might be able to help us get there rather than from, constantly getting in the way. And then, so if democracy is not this last stop on our civic journey, then what's the next stop? And how would I go about writing a book like that? And then I thought, well, what more democratic than to travel the world and just speak to people and let their voices write the book? So I weaved people's responses into grander stories. The book reads in a very dreamy, polyphonic kind of way. It reads like a novel that many people uh, got together and wrote. It summarizes, the first few chapters summarize the responses that I got to those questions. And then the very last chapter, and this is what I'm leaving you with, um, I synthesized responses and suggestions that people gave to make 10 propositions for moving democracy forward. I won't spend too much time talking about these. the number 10 is symbolic. I thought 10 it could have been 15, could have been 20, but I thought 10, as in the 10 commandments. There's some symbolic value in that. The first one has to do, and these all reflect things that came up time and time again in the conversations that I had with people around the world. So those were all the things that united us. The first one had to do with reversing the trend. We now have very strong capitalism and soft democracy. So going instead to soft capitalism and strong democracy. Finding a way to emphasize forms and encourage forms of microgovernance, because people told me that they were most motivated when they worked in small civic communities around their neighborhoods. So find ways to mobilize and activate those and connect them to governance. Counting absence, so this business where we say that 50% of the country doesn't vote, and we that doesn't mean anything, and we assume that those people are not interested in politics. That's not true. Those people are interested in politics. They just don't like the options that they're being given. So let's find a way to count for that. Um, distinction between long and short-term politics. Agree on some common goals that take beyond 4 or 5 years to achieve, and connect around them as long term goals, and then set short term goals, and then have politicians run on that basis. Beyond voting, so naturally, voting is very important, but I think asking people to only be engaged with the people who govern them once every 4 or 5 years is a little bit condescending. We can certainly come up with other ways of engaging the public beyond referenda, of course. I'm not referring to referenda. A civic education for all. By education here, I mean not necessarily going to the right school, because Ted Cruz went to Princeton and then Harvard Law, but that didn't stop him from motivating and mobilizing QAnon publics, but rather cultivating a civic consciousness, communicating a sense of what democracy is really about, and also cultivating the traits of diplomacy, centrism, and compromise that can drive away from polarization. Forgetting messiahs, we tend to expect everything of our politicians, and we elevate them into these impossible pedestals. Plus, we expect them to be TV performers. So I think we have to make up our minds. Do we want people to look good on TV, or do we want them to act well in office? And we have to understand that people who govern well a lot of times are not going to be very, very telegenic. Game the system, take some agency in all of this. Direct our gaze. Don't spend our time focusing or following clickbait headlines. Change what we pay attention. So change what we pay attention to, so that then platforms change what they produce for us to supposedly consume. Do something different with journalism, understand really what objectivity is about, because we've been chronically misunderstanding that. And finally, be our own agents of civic change, be civic adults. Stop being civic teenagers who give up too soon, who expect too much, who are overjoyed. Those things are great for teenagers. Let's teenagers be teenagers, so that they can mature into civic adults who understand that technologies network us, but in the end, it is our stories that connect us, identify us, but also divide us. And then let's find ways to use technologies to tell the stories that are going to connect us. Thank you.
The question I have, which is a really difficult question, but it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about that. It has to do with a particular thing that you talked about, and it relates to hashtag activism and this issue of if social media can make or break elections, or if it can make or break politics. And let's see if you can help me out here, because something that I often say when I am asked to say things about the effects of social media on politics. This is sort of the short version. What I always say is like, we must not be technological determinists. Digital media will get different consequences in different circumstances for
Mhm.
different people. Then I can give examples saying it can play some form of role, even if it's not the deciding factor, maybe, but it can play some form of role in overthrowing dictatorships, promoting racial and gender equality. There's lots of examples of that. But at the same time, it can be a place for racists and anti-feminists and other to mobilize their hatred and so on. And I mean, there's been sort of uh, um, a turn as well, I think, because the examples that we used in, say, around 2012, they were the Arab Spring, it was Anonymous, it was Occupy, and so on. And in sort of the footprints following that, it's like Black Lives Matter and Me Too have been two huge things. But the examples that we have today, they are more likely to be Trump, Brexit, disinformation, the alt right, incels, and so on. So, the question when does social media promote democracy and when does it promote the opposite? Do we know that? Do
uh,
we know anything about that?
yeah, we do. We can point to specific times when it successfully promoted democracy, but I mean, it's really interesting, and I know you understand this because you started with this question of let's not be technological determinists. So I think it's very interesting, when we pose this question as when does social media do this or that or the other, we kind of put a distance between ourselves and these platforms. And um, I know that you and I don't forget this, but it almost prompts us to forget that it's us on these platforms saying or doing these things. So um, it's us deciding how to focus the conversation. It's us deciding to step away from an argument that is becoming toxic. It's us deciding to click on that clickbait headline or to um, retweet something or to keep watching or to keep reporting something that is not really driving conversation forward. So I think a lot of the decisions or the things that we blame or give credit to social media for are really things that we do ourselves. They relate to agency that we have taken. They relate to action that we have taken. So for example, with President Trump and his use of Twitter, which I will continue to say that he continues to be, I mean, he's off Twitter now, but he was up until recently the only politician who figured out how to use it to his benefit. I haven't encountered another politician in my studies who's used it so masterfully. Did he use it to the benefit of democracy? No. But did he use it to his own benefit? Of course. And the result, of course, is, he chose a medium that was particularly friendly to his persona, as was reality TV. And he just really made the most of it. And we can see this because now, post Twitter, he's just not really interested in appearing in any other platforms that don't bear the design affordances of Twitter. So there's part of it that has to do with who we are and what we do on there. But yes, there is also um, part of it has to do with how these things are designed. I'm a soft determinist. So if you ask, when do they help democracy and do they not? I would say I would go back to that first proposition for moving democracy forward that I made about implementing ways and structures of soft capitalism and stronger democracy. I think all too often when we design technology, the question that we ask is, not necessarily who's going to want to buy it or is the best thing that we can design, but rather how much profit are we going to make out of this? And this does not just apply to social platforms. I'm teaching a class this semester on technology and social change. And I was just rereading this article called How the Refrigerator Got Its Hum, which you You're nodding along because you've heard of it, but it talks about, the industrial and economic decisions that led to, the refrigerator having a hum, and makes the point in the end that so much of the way in which technology and is designed in the West, and in particularly US, because I don't want the rest of the world to, or the entirety of the globe to take the blame for this, has to do with asking the question, what's the profit margin? Rather than asking, are people going to be interested in this, and why, and what is it going to do with them? I don't think that, democracy and capitalism are irreconcilable. There's the assumption that they are. I don't think um I think they can be reconciled, but I think there's ways in which that we can have technology that's meaningful for democracy, and but that also allows people to obtain, employment, to turn a reasonable profit.